today will be 143. So the translation and purport for this verse is, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu continued, wherever Vedic mantras describe the absolute truth impersonally, only prove in the end that the absolute truth is a person. The Supreme Lord is understood in two features, impersonal and personal. If one considers the Supreme Personality of Godhead in both features, he can actually understand the absolute truth. He knows that the personal understanding is stronger because we see that everything is full of variety. No one can see anything that is not full of variety. So there's a very small purport where Prabhupada says, this is a quotation from the Sri Chaitanya Chandradaya Natak 6.67 by Kavi Kanpur. And today's main verse is text number 143, which you can see on your screens. Brahma hoite janma vishwa brahmite jivaya, se brahme punarapi haya yaya laya. So the translation and purport by His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada. Everything in the cosmic manifestation emanates from the absolute truth, remains in the absolute truth, and after annihilation again enters the absolute truth. So purport by His Divine Grace. In the Taittiriya Upanishad 3.1 it is said, Yato va imani bhutani jayante. The entire material cosmic manifestation is born of the Supreme Brahman. Also in the Brahma Sutra, the Brahma Sutra begins with the verse Janmadi asya yataha. The absolute truth is that from whom everything emanates. Srimad Bhagavatam 1.1.2. The absolute truth is Krishna. In the Bhagavad Gita 10.8, Krishna says, Aham sarvasya prabhavo mataha sarvam pravartate. I am the source of all spiritual and material worlds. Everything emanates from me. Therefore, Krishna is the original absolute truth, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Again, Krishna states in the Bhagavad Gita 9.4, Maya tatam idam sarvam jagat avyakta murtina. By me, in my unmanifested form, this entire universe is pervaded. And as confirmed in the Brahma Samhita 5.37, Goloka eva nivasati akhilatma bhuta. Although the Lord always stays in his abode, Golok Vrindavan, he is still all-pervading. His all-pervasive feature is understood to be impersonal because one does not find the form of the Lord in that all-pervasiveness. Actually, everything is resting on the rays of his bodily effulgence. The Brahma Samhita 5.40 also states, Yasya prabha prabhavato jagadananda koti koti shvashesha vasudhati vibhuti binna. Due to the rays of the Lord's bodily effulgence, millions of universes are created just as planets are created from the sun. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadhati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yutapad Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Sadvadutam Parijana Sahitam Shri Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gaurange Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Suti Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prashtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prashtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Iti Namine Shri Varshabhana Videvi Daitaya Karpabde Krishna Sambandha Vigyana Dahine Prabhave Namaha Madhyarujvala Premadashi Rupanuga Bhaktidashi Gaura Karuna Shakti Vigrahaya Namostate. Namaste Gauravani Shimurtai Dina Tarine Rupanuga Viruddha Siddhanta Divantaharine. Namo Gaur Kishoraya Saksha Vairagya Murtaye Vipralambara Sambodhe Padambujayate Namaha. Namo Bhakti Vinodaya Satchitananda Namine Gaura Shakti Swarupaya Rupanuga Varayate. Gaura Vibhabhamestam Nirdeshta Sajjana Priya Vaishnava Sarvabhaumashi Jagannatha Te Namaha. Vanchakalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhubh Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivas Adi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, dear devotees. So thank you all for giving me this opportunity for self-purification and service. We're discussing a very, very blissful part of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. In fact, the whole part of the Chaitanya Charitamrita is blissful. But this particular chapter is very, very, I felt, speaking directly to me as I was preparing and reading through the verses. I remember a few years ago, I was fortunate enough with my spiritual master, we were driving, and somehow or another, the conversation came up about studying of Shastra. And so I remember it was the time of Ram Navami. Maharaj was saying how when we study the Shastra, we should really try to absorb ourselves and just imagine what it must have been like. Put yourself in the Shastra. So he was speaking specifically about Dashrath, King Dashrath, how he performed a fire sacrifice in order to beget children. And from that fire, a personality came holding a pot of sweet rice. And he was saying, just imagine the sight of someone coming out of a fire. Imagine what that sweet rice must have tasted like. Probably unlike anything we've ever had. So therefore, the smells, the sights, the sounds, the tastes, the feelings, imagining being there gives so much more absorption and gives a very experiential and relatable experience with Shastra. And so that's what I tried to do here when I was reading through the liberation of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. Just imagine, being there and seeing the interaction. And if those words were directed towards me, how would I feel? It gives such a wonderful dynamic to our study of scripture. So as we know, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya is one of the most intimate associates of the Lord. Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami in this chapter very eloquently explains the events that led up to the deliverance of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. And when I was reading through this, and this verse included, I found that there were three very important qualities that the Lord exhibited in his dealings, in his attitude, in delivering Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, which for me immediately just stood out. And when I thought about it, these same qualities were actually there in so many other conversations of the Lord, whether they be Prakashananda Saraswati, which happened after this episode, or whether it be the Digvijay Pandit, which happened previously in the Lord Navadip pastimes. So as we know, Lord Chaitanya is the absolute truth, the supreme personality of Godhead. And out of his inconceivable mercy, the Lord manifests himself in this material world to show by his own personal example what it means to be a devotee of himself. Therefore, through this pastime, the Lord is instructing us as his servants and as his preachers that what we need to become in order to become effective in our attempts to liberate the modern day Sarvabhauma Bhattacharyas and people of this world. And what better way of teaching us how to do that than through his very own example. So the Lord's life is a perfect exemplar for for us to aspire to if we want to be effective preachers in the Sankirtan movement. And Prabhupada did say that ISKCON is a continuation of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. So very quickly then, this pastime begins when Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya saw the Lord for the first time in the temple of Jagannath. The Lord, out of ecstasy, fell unconscious on the floor. And when one of the pandas threatened to beat him, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya jumps in and immediately stops him from doing so. So when I read that, my first thought was, some things don't change. The pandas or the watchmen, as Prabhupada describes them here as, try to, beat the Lord 500 years ago. And the same thing happens even today. I remember my first time in Puri. I was at the manor before going to India and visiting Jagannath Puri. Devotees were telling me all the stories of the pandas and the watchmen guarding the gates and questioning people and even beating them up and chasing them if they had a suspicion of them not being Hindu or not being born in India. And at that time, I felt, well, I'm literally traveling the other side of the world, to visit Jagannath Puri. One way or another, I'm going to get into that temple. I had quite a firm conviction in this. So as I was queuing to get to the temple, there were two pandas by the gates carrying sticks that were just hitting everyone that went in, anyone. But they were just tapping them with these sticks. And I remember I entered with a group of about 5 or 6 of us on that trip. It was the sabbatical program. Remember, as I got in, one of the pandas hit me on the back of the leg, which I felt was quite hard. So when I got inside, I was just happy to get in. I got inside and asked the devotee that was with us, why do they hit people like that? And he says it's just to remind them symbolically that to surrender to the soul, that to surrender to Jagannath when you go inside. So then I figured, but I felt that I got hit, good amount on the back of my leg. And then reflecting on it that evening, I thought it must have meant that maybe I was more reluctant to surrender to Jagannath, so therefore needed a stronger reminder when I entered. And then we get into the main temple room for those that may have been here. And I remember it being very, very medieval. The walls were black. The deities of Jagannath, Baladev, Subhadra were there. They had these huge flames of fire on the side, which gave the light. And then as I approached Jagannath, right in front of him, one of the pandas from the back of my neck grabbed me and put my head down at the feet of Jagannath and held me by the back of my neck. An act of aggressive compassion, as I put it. But it was welcome nevertheless. So at that point, they were rough then and they were rough back now, even now. So some things don't change. So one of the first qualities that stand out, not only in the Lord's conversation with Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, but with other scholars, other conversations that he had, is that the Lord won them over by his effulgence, his beauty. And specifically in this case, by the transformations that were there on the Lord's body. So Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya became very enamored by this. The bodily effulgence of the Lord and his personal beauty were extremely powerful attributes that attracted even the minds of the most hardened scholars. Prabhura Sundarya Ara Prema Vikar Dekhi Sarvabhauma Hoila Vismita Apar. Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya was very surprised to see the personal beauty of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, as well as the transcendental transformations wrought on his body due to love of Godhead. So when Mahaprabhu's debate with Prakashananda Saraswati, you'll see parallels in this. The Lord is sitting in the footwash of the sannyasis and begins to exhibit his bodily glow, thus attracting the minds and hearts of Prakashananda Saraswati and his disciples. And sometimes we see that even here, even now in this age, that when we see devotees, sometimes they have an aura, or sometimes we say, you're glowing, they have an effulgence, they become very attractive, they become very inspiring, and we become drawn to them. So Lord Chaitanya's power is such that even just by looking at him, pure love of God would awaken in the hearts of people. We see the example of the fisherman that touched his body because he got caught up in the net, and immediately he becomes ecstatic. So practically speaking, what does that mean for us? For us, it means the first lesson the Lord is showing here. For us, it means purity. Prabhupada said purity is the force, purity that comes from our sadhana, our daily, sincere, spiritual practice of Krishna consciousness. So this was the first lesson here that Mahaprabhu teaches us on how to convince people of the philosophy, but also how to change their hearts, how to cause that revolution from within. And we can only do that if, first of all, we have a degree of purity. Now, later on in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, in this Madhya Lila, in the 11th chapter entitled the Beda Kirtan Pastimes, the devotees from Navadvip come to Puri for the Rath Yatra. And there, Maharaj Pratap Rudra, who was the king of Orissa at that time, the king of Puri, says to Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, Raja kahe yanra mala dila dui jana, ascharya teja bada mahanta kaha kono jana. That the king said that, who is this person that Swarup Damodar and Govinda offered the garlands to? His bodily effulgence is so great that he must be a very great devotee. Please let me know, who is this person? That person was Advaita Acharya, who had just arrived. And then the king goes on to say, Dekhi mora hoila chamatkar Vaishnavera aiche teja dekhi nahi ar. That the king said, upon seeing all these devotees, I'm very much astonished. Why? Because I have never seen such effulgence. Koti Surya Sama Saba Ujvala Varan Kabu Mahi Shuniye Madhurya Kirtan. Indeed, the effulgence is like the brilliance of 1,000,000 suns, he said. Nor have I ever heard the Lord's names chanted so melodiously. So during the Rath Yatra, Kirtan groups from all over the land, all the singers, all the dancers, performers, devotees from all over the place would come and descend upon Puri. And being the king, Maharaj Pratap Rudra would have seen all of them. But he was attracted particularly to the followers of Lord Chaitanya. Why? In those purports, Prabhupada writes that because of the rigorous practice of devotional service, the devotees develop such purity and effulgence that they can attract the minds of even the most influential people of this world. Now, there was one very influential person, this has come to me now, in the time of Bhakti Siddhanta. I think he was a king or very prominent figure in society who wanted to speak to Bhakti Siddhanta. They had a disagreement on something, and this person wanted to speak to Bhakti Siddhanta to say, no, it's not going to happen. I'm putting my foot down. He came to, have an argument. So he describes that he was walking to the Gaudiya Math where Bhakti Siddhanta was residing, and he goes, I just went into his room straight away. Not going to take no for an answer. I'm really going to make my point forcefully to him. And he walks in, and Bhakti Siddhanta is sitting on his desk, and he looks up as you naturally would if someone burst into your room. And this person explains that just by the glance and his personal persona of Bhakti Siddhanta, he goes, despite him wanting to really argue, he felt his head immediately just come to the ground and bow in awe and reverence to the Acharya. Such was the power of the devotees of the Lord. So we may not be able to exhibit such effulgence, but what this is teaching us is that we can work on our purity through our devotional principles, so that when we go out and explain the philosophy of Sri Chaitanya, our preaching can have an impact. Purity is the thing which really makes a devotee different from ordinary people in this world. I remember some time ago, I was staying at the Govardhan Eco Village before it got developed into the Govardhan Eco Village. And one devotee there was doing a presentation about, sattvic living. And he was talking about, the detrimental effects of plastic pollution globally, but also in the local area. And, he went through this really insightful presentation about the dangers of plastic and how it destroys so many habitats and wildlife and the environment around us. And then after his presentation, I remember the devotees were so fired up. They were like, great, let's go out and we'll educate all the villagers. There was so much enthusiasm just from this presentation on plastic. And this devotee said to them, hold your horses. He said, first, let us practice for some time. Only then will our words have potency. Which was a very striking point for me. In other words, when we speak, our words are infused with whatever degree of purity, realization, and sincerity that we have. The more pure we become, the more powerful our words become. and the more impact that they have. So this is the first principle Lord Chaitanya teaches us in this conversation with Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, as well as many other of his pastimes and conversations, his effulgence, for which means our purity. Very important point. So that's the first. The second principle, through this discussion with Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya and the events leading up to it, Lord Chaitanya shows us through his own example, is that of Dainya or Amanik Dvam, which basically means humility. Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya had two primary concerns with Lord Chaitanya. The first was that the Lord took sannyas from the Bharati Sampradaya, which was seen by Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya as being an inferior form of sannyas, and therefore he felt that he was able to bring the Lord to a higher level of sannyas from the Saraswati Sampradaya. And the second issue he had was that he felt that the Lord, being so young, attractive, he may struggle to maintain his vows as a sannyasi. So when the devotees, Gopinath Acharya, Mukunda Dutt, heard what Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya was saying, they became very angry. That how dare you say this? This is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He's beyond all of these things. And they came to the Lord with disturbed minds and said and bitterness towards Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, and said, this is what he's saying about you. How dare he? And what was Mahaprabhu's response? What was his disposition? Shuni Mahaprabhu kahe aicha mat kaha ami prati bhattacharyera hoya anugraha. So hearing this, Mahaprabhu said to the devotees, do not speak like that. Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya has shown great affection and mercy towards me. Amara sannyas dharma kahena rakite vatsalya karuna karena ki doshi hate. That out of parental affection for me, he wants to protect me and see that I follow the regulative principles of a sannyasi. What fault is there in this? So Lord Chaitanya is showing that he only wanted to see the purity of intent in Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, that he cares for me like a father cares for his son. Very, very interesting how the Lord reacted to those words of the devotees. So despite this, when Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya met with the Lord to teach him Vedanta, this is how, these are the words that he directly said to the Supreme Lord. Vedanta Shravan e Sanyasera Dharma Nirantara Karitumi Vedanta Shravana. The Bhattacharya said that hearing Vedanta philosophy is a sannyasi's main business. Therefore, without hesitation, you should study Vedanta philosophy, hearing it without cessation from a superior person. Could you imagine? And what was the Lord's response? How did he exhibit this humility through his own dealings? Prabhu kahe, more tumi kara anugraha say kartavya tumi ye mora kaha. That you're very merciful to me. And therefore, I think it's my duty to obey your order. And we see how Lord Chaitanya exhibited such humility towards Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. This is very, 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 very powerful lesson here. That humility is such an attractive quality that it can set the foundations for transformations when we preach. Why? Because if we come across as arrogant or develop a holier than thou sort of a mentality, people can see that and immediately they put their defenses up. And to penetrate anyone whose defenses have been raised is very difficult. But when devotees develop a deep-rooted, genuine degree of humility, people don't see you as a threat. They lower their guard, so to speak, and develop a favorable disposition towards devotees. Arrogance is rampant in the material world. Therefore, people can smell it a mile off. And humility is very rare. And people can also pick up on that just as easily because it's unique, it's different, it's refreshing, it's appealing, and it's very, very attractive. Even the Lord's heart is attracted and melted by the extreme humility of Rupa Sanatana Goswami, of Haridas Thakur. But it's not always easy. It's easy said, but actually to develop humility, it can be quite difficult. So I remember some years back now, a few days before I was about to take the saffron cloth and commit myself for a bit more longer in the ashram at the manor, I was there in Japa period in the morning in the temple room. I was sitting by Tulsi and there was a devotee there, Probably this still goes on now, but he was there talking. And I didn't want to seem rude, so I stopped my japa to listen to him as he kept talking and talking. And there was one devotee walking around Tulsi. And as he was walking around Tulsi, he became very angry at the talking. And he pointed me out. And he said, "You keep talking. You're disturbing my japa. Can you not just be quiet?" To put it nicely. And I felt very, very agitated by this because I felt, hold up. I wasn't even talking. The other person's talking to me and this story is having a go at me. And, it was playing on my mind for the rest of that day. I became a bit annoyed. I became a bit angry. And then I was thinking to myself that, why can't I just be humble about the situation? Why can't I just swallow it and just apologize and just, learn from this rather than getting angry and defensive about it? So the next morning, I made a point to get a Mangalarti sweet and I gave it to this devotee. I took him out into the Prashadam room. I gave him this sweet and I said, "I apologize for disturbing your japa. It won't happen again." And it was a bitter pill to swallow. However, it is a necessary medicine to take. When I went back into the temple room, I could feel the reciprocation of Krishna because they were some of my best rounds that I have ever had. So it is difficult to develop humility. However, I found that being in a sangha of devotees is such a benediction because there will never be any shortages of opportunities to become humble like a blade of grass or tolerant like a tree. The opportunities will present themselves in abundance. And I always look back at my time in the ashram at the manor with great fondness and remember even being humbled on certain occasions as well. And it is very, very important that we develop this deep-rooted humility. Because not only in Lord Chaitanya himself, through this conversation with Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, but all the great devotees of Lord Chaitanya have exhibited such humility in their character that sometimes it's heart-wrenching. Take Bhakti Siddhanta, for example, famous for being a lion guru, a simha guru, with being a fearless, heroic, the most non-compromising preacher. Yet simultaneously, he was also the embodiment of Vaishnav humility. And we don't often focus on the softer side of Bhakti Siddhanta. So once in the Gaudiya Mutt, some very respectable ladies came to offer him respects after a class of his. And they offered their obeisances and they were approaching him to offer flowers at his lotus feet. Okay. And at that point, he checked them, he stopped them. And this is what he said. So I've got the quote here. He said this, "O mothers, I am wholly unworthy of the respect you propose to show me. The body that I presently inhabit should be incessantly whipped and plastered with dust and mud, thrown in a gutter and left there. He to whom you had offered obeisances considers himself lower than a maggot of hell. He is particularly shy about this act of yours, seeing which he wonders why he is sitting on a raised seat. Considering you to be servants of Krishna, he offers 10,000 obeisances at your feet. Dasosmi." Now, this is one of the most fascinating achintya aspects of the Lord and of the devotees for me. That how can they be so powerful, so influential, and at the same time harbor such degrees of humility? How is it that devotees of Lord Chaitanya can be so great, but think themselves so fallen? That paradox is just fascinating. So as preachers, we may need a thick skin, but simultaneously we need a soft heart. So here is Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya practically, looking down on the Lord in a way, saying, "I'm going to elevate you. You need to learn from a superior person." And he's saying this to the person who, is the object of the Vedas. Sarvasya chaham hirdis sanivishtu mata smritir jnanam pohanam cha vedascha sarveraham eva vedayo vedantagrit vedavit eva chaham. That I'm seated in everyone's heart. From me comes remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness. By all the Vedas, I am to be known. Indeed, I am the compiler of Vedanta, and I am the knower of the Vedas. Yet the Lord exhibits such humility towards Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, very, very inconceivable. So when we think of preaching, we often think of explaining the philosophy. But actually preaching is much more dynamic than that. It was St. Francis who said we should always preach, and every now and again we can say something. So another facet of humility, which is very important from this pastime, that the Lord shows is the ability to listen. The ability to listen can also greatly assist in our outreach work. Lord Chaitanya listened to Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya's impersonal explanations of Vedanta for 7 full days. Satta dina paryanta aiche karena shravane, bala manda nahi kahe, vasi matra shune. For Satta dina, 7 days, Lord Chaitanya listened to the philosophy expounded by Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. And interestingly enough, the Lord did not say anything. He didn't indicate whether it was right or whether it was wrong. He simply sat there and listened to the Bhattacharya. This takes a tremendous amount of humility, self-control, patience to sit and listen for that long. When we learn to listen to people, it shows that we respect them and value them enough to listen to what they actually have to say. There's a famous saying that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Well, listening shows that you actually care. Empathic listening means I'm listening not only to respond, but to understand first. So we often give an analogy of ISKCON being like a hospital and devotees are all like doctors. But when you ever go to a doctor, the first thing they do is they listen to what the problem is and then prescribe the medicine to tackle that problem. They will never straight away just download everything they've learnt in medical school about medicine, but rather they will target their approach to the person in front of them. By having the humility of listen, we get an opportunity to hear the unheard, to find out where people are at, what they're thinking and feeling, what issues they may have. And then we can deliver the philosophy of Lord Chaitanya. We can deliver Krishna consciousness in a way that is relevant to them, giving them not what we want to say, but what they need to hear. I remember a devotee telling me that whenever he goes for any preaching engagement, he always prays to Prabhupada to help him to say to his audience what they need to hear, not necessarily what he himself just feels like telling them. So after hearing like this for 7 days, patiently, with such humility, with such respect, Sarvabhauma asks the Lord that you haven't said a single word. Are you even understanding anything? Like, what's going through your mind? So it takes wisdom knowing when we should listen and when we should speak. If we speak when we should have actually listened, there can be problems. And if we listen when we should actually have spoken up, then it can be equally as problematic. But by this time, when Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya asked the Lord, like, what are you thinking? Through his effulgence and humility, the Lord had already forged a relationship with Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. He had already endeared himself to the Bhattacharya and therefore now could speak very directly to him. Prakriti vinita sannyasi dekite sundara amara bahu priti bhade inhara upara. That even before this conversation, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya said that this sannyasi is very meek and humble by nature, and his persona is very beautiful to see. Again, his humility and his effulgence, the purity. Consequently, my affection for him increases. So the relationship was already established. And now, when asked to speak, when asked to reveal his mind, Mahaprabhu can be very direct. He can be very forthright and he can speak his mind. Prabhu kahe sutra artha bujiya nirmala tumara vakya suni mana hoya ta vikala. The Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu then revealed his mind. And what did he say? I understand the meaning of each sutra very clearly, but your explanations have simply agitated my mind. So this is again the Lord listening and now knowing when to speak. Sutrera artha bhashya kahe prakashya, tumi bhashya kahe sutrera artha achadiya. That the meaning of the Vedanta Sutra is very clear. The purports are clear in themselves. But your purports that you presented simply cover the meaning of the sutras like a cloud. Very, very direct. Could you imagine Sarvabhauma's reaction and what he must have been thinking? Sutrera mukhya artha na karaha vakhyana kalpanarthe tumi taha kara achadana. That you do not explain the direct meaning of the Brahma Sutras. Indeed, it appears that your business is to actually cover their real meaning. So imagine saying this to possibly the most learned person at the time. So when the Lord said these very direct words, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya had already developed a favorable disposition towards the Lord due to his purity and his humility. There was a rapport, there was already a relationship. And so after hearing these words from Lord Chaitanya, Sarvabhauma was intrigued to hear what the Lord had to say. Okay, he didn't take it as a threat. He didn't take it as an attack because he knew this Lord is adorned with humility. He's not like that. So he became very intrigued. Okay, what does the Lord have to say? And this leads us to the third principle. So the first was effulgence of the Lord, which for us means our purity. The second is our humility. And the third is philosophical acumen. So now this is where the Lord gave the most comprehensive philosophy of God realization, pure Gaudiya Siddhanta. The external meaning of the word Gaudiya has two meanings. The external meaning is Gaudadesh, East or Bengal. But the internal meaning of the word Gaudiya comes from the word Gur or Jagri, which means very, very sweet. So the philosophy of Sri Chaitanya is the sweetest philosophy. Gaudiya Vaishnavas are the sweetest among the Vaishnavas. And that the Lord is, he explains that the Lord is impersonal and personal at the same time. That the Lord is the source of all rasa, of all shakti, and the most mature understanding of the Lord is as the supreme personality of Godhead. And one of the effects you find from the philosophy of Lord Chaitanya, the philosophical content of Chaitanya's philosophy, is that the Lord's philosophy is very unifying. This Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva philosophy of Mahaprabhu harmonizes the two traditional schools of thought, namely the Advaita philosophy and the Dvaita philosophy. It has the power to unite people from every spectrum of society. So whether they are staunch sannyasis like Prakashananda Saraswati, whether they are like the academically brilliant scholars like Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, whether they are aristocratic royalty like Maharaj Pratap Rudra, whether they're diseased like Vasudeva the leper, poverty-stricken like Golavetra Sridhar, even the Muslims and like Chand Kazi and the Pathan Vaishnavas, the Buddhists, your Jagai and Madais, as well as the common folk of the time, all were united under the Lord's Sankirtan movement. So we find that these three very essential principles in this pastime for the preachers in the line of Lord Chaitanya. And we shall forever remain indebted to Prabhupada, who so expertly presented the philosophy of Lord Chaitanya to the world through his books and his own personal example. The fact that we have access to the highest truths of the Supreme Lord so readily available is purely because of Prabhupada's mercy to this world. It's very, very interesting how in this pastime, in this particular verse as well, Prabhupada gives so many verses to establish that Krishna is the supreme personality of Godhead as a person. And in one of the purports leading up to this verse, after Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya had spoken, Prabhupada said this is typical of impersonalists. That what they do is that they sometimes don't take the direct meanings of Shastra, that they sometimes take, for example, when Krishna says surrender to me, they take that and, through word jugglery, make that into what it means, surrender to the unlimited within Krishna. And people will go to extreme lengths in order to, fit the agenda that they want. But Mahaprabhu here is teaching that, the meaning of Shastra is very clear, is very direct. And through Prabhupada's books, we have such a clear, focused understanding of who the Supreme Personality of Godhead is. There is no duplicity. And And that is something which I think attracts the mind of so many devotees. The philosophy of Sri Chaitanya that he expounded in this conversation with Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, when we first heard it, for many of us, from my experience with devotees and for me as well, was very clear cut. Almost like in a philosophical jungle, this was the clear path that made things so understandable, so relatable. And so we owe a great deal of debt to Prabhupada for making this knowledge so readily accessible and distributed to every corner of the world. The other day we had a sangha of devotees to remember Shruti Dharma Prabhu's life. And when I thought of him, I was also thinking that he served as the perfect example of these three principles that we've spoken about here today. So it's my sincere prayer to him and to all of you that, having spoken about these three things so much, that I can also come to develop them myself one day. And I pray that you can inspire me to become more dedicated, more sincere in my service to Hari, Guru and the Vaishnavas. Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu ki jai, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya ki jai, Chaitanya Charitamrita ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Go Premanande, Hari Hari Bol. So thank you all so much for this opportunity. I think we may have some time for questions. So I'll hand it back to the devotees here. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Thank you so much for your sweet words. I appreciate them. Very precious to hear Harikatha. So there is one question from Prayojan Prabhu from the temple room. And he's asking, Mother Kulangana said to always take the humble position. However, when somebody is being blasphemed, how should we act? Sorry.
Yeah, very good question. Thank you, Prayojan Prabhu. Hare Krishna. Yeah, how can we act? So when we hear blaspheme or blaspheming of devotees, there's different approaches. One should either walk away or one can engage. If sometimes, let's take the example of Prabhupada. When people said things about Krishna that weren't accurate, he became very, very forceful. He became very, very strong, almost, like a lion guru himself. And sometimes that may be needed to protect the Lord, to protect the name of the Vaishnavas, to protect the Siddhanta. But inside our heart, we shouldn't have any animosity to the people that are doing this. That when we have to become strong and develop a thick skin in our preaching, that we're doing it actually in our service to the devotees. So this is what I meant by thick skin and a soft heart. Sometimes we may need to, defend the philosophy. Sometimes we may need to deal with situations with a bit of, forcefulness on occasions. But inside our hearts, we should never have any animosity. We should always keep that mindset that if I have to protect, I'm doing it out of humility, that I'm a servant to the Guru, I'm a servant to the Vaishnavas, I'm a servant of the Supreme Lord. And in that way, I think we can find the balance. Remember, it should never be personal. It should always be against what the person has said. And I think that's a very important distinction to make as well. So I think, yes, with blaspheming, either you can walk away, or if you're in a position where you may have to say something, then say and be forceful and be, brave and heroic if need be. But in our hearts, we should always, not develop hatred for the person for doing it. And we should always, do it with the purest intentions. And I think that's how you can get the balance when sometimes we're faced with situations like that.
Thank you. Thank you for that practical explanation on how to respond. There's another linked question from Guru Das. He says, are humility and tolerance related, or are they two separate qualities? This is the question.
They can be related. Thank you, Guru Das Bro. They can be related. Trinadapi Sunichena, be more humble than a blade of grass, more tolerant than a tree. This was like, the most important verse for devotees. They sort of are interrelated, tolerating difficult situations, means that, I'm not the controller, I'm not the enjoyer, I'm helpless in a certain way. So to have that mentality that I am not the controller, I am not the enjoyer, so let me just tolerate, that takes a degree of humility to have that understanding. So I think they can be interrelated in that way. I've got a personal message. I think Prashant accidentally sent it directly to me as opposed to the general group. He says, is there a generic principle of when one should speak and when one should listen? How do we differentiate? Very, very important. Very, very good question. I mentioned earlier when I said that, I said it takes wisdom. So sometimes through experience, we may know, life experience and experience in dealing with others, we may know when to speak and when to listen. But probably as a general principle, as Mahaprabhu exhibited here, if you need to know what you're going to speak about. And the only way you know what you to speak about or what to say is maybe if you listen first. So when Mahaprabhu spoke today's verse to Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, he knew what to say because he listened first of where Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya was coming from. So I think as a general principle, I would say probably better to listen first and then you know when to speak, if that makes sense. Thank you, Prashant.
Hare Krishna. So continue, some more questions are coming up. It's people are reciprocating, it's a good sign. And Maria Carolina in the temple room, I believe, said, you say humility is impressive, but how do we draw the line between humility and low self-esteem?
Yeah, very, very good question. So the difference between low self-esteem and humility is that of confidence. When you hear the acharyas, like, Bhaktisiddhanta from that quote, he was saying that he was, felt himself lower than a maggot of hell. Very, very powerful, very, very, upright statement. So the difference is that when he said that, he had absolute faith in the Supreme Lord. Okay? That there's always hope. So I may be, not very good at this. I may not be very good at that. I may feel very low, but I've got hope. That with the Lord's mercy, with the mercy of devotees, that, I can be useful. I can do things. However, when it comes to low self-esteem, not only do we think of ourselves as low, but actually then there's no hope. There's no confidence. So that's, I would say, is the difference between low self-esteem and humility. Humility means that I may think of myself low, but I have confidence in the mercy of the Supreme Lord, that there is hope. But low self-esteem means I not only think of myself low, but there's no hope. And that can be, very, very damaging. So it says here, you mentioned you took it on the chin when you got told off for disturbing someone's japa, but in fact it wasn't you. So you were being humble, but perhaps this was a situation where you should have spoken up, but stayed quiet. So yes, that did cross my mind. I was thinking maybe I should just tell him, Prabhu, you got it wrong. It wasn't me who was speaking. You should have had to go at the other guy. But I saw the situation as, this is an opportunity for me just to be humble. And sometimes we try to justify it. We try to fight back. And I thought this is an opportunity for me just to put my hands up and just say it. I remember I heard a story actually when I was in India. There was one sannyasi who was giving a class in front of thousands of people. Okay, huge class. And there was someone in the audience who was talking. And this sannyasi became very angry and he said, look, if you don't want to be here, just get up and leave. And this devotee was so embarrassed, so shocked. You could see. And everyone is looking around like, who is this person? Who is this person? Next to him was a brahmachari. And the brahmachari could see the distraught, how distraught this devotee was. And in front of everyone, he stood up and he walked out. So people actually thought it was him, just so he could, give this devotee, a little break. So sometimes, yeah, we can fight back, we can do that, but I just felt that this was an opportunity Krishna has given me. And even though it wasn't me, let me practice humility anyway, because it will be beneficial for me. And therefore I didn't, even probably to this day, I don't know if he's listening to this class, but even today, I've never mentioned that, and I don't think I ever will. I just took it as this is a lesson I need to learn.
Hare Krishna, thank you. So there's one last question from Abhay Prabhu in the temple room, and he asks, how long should we spend listening and helping someone who is unwilling to change? Or is there a point where we should just cut off things?
Yeah, very, very good question. Thank you, Abhay Prabhu. Hare Krishna. So this is important because we need to understand when we see this pastime Lord Chaitanya, where our limits are, what our limitations are. So, for example, me personally, I may not have the personal spiritual strength to sit there and listen to Mayavad philosophy for 7 days from a scholar like Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya without coming out bewildered by the whole situation. So we have to know what our limits are, how much we should listen or how much we can take, and then when to cut things off. And that also comes through experience, that comes through your own reflection and own realization. So I give you an example. When I first started going out on book distribution, I remember I used to go out with Sutapa Prabhu. We did the marathon together in 2007. And when there were people who were unwilling to listen, unwilling to change, just wanted to debate, in those days, I remember I used to just get into it. I found some, intellectual gratification from doing that. But then over time, I realized, they're not willing to change. They're just there for a confrontation. And through that experience, you just know when you can just cut it off. You when to say, thank you very much. I'm going to go on my way. So that comes through experience, when to do that, and being honest with how much you can listen to. There might be a time where you have to listen to it in order to then, offer the highest benediction to that person. So we need to know and understand our own limitations and try not to imitate the levels of Mahaprabhus or the great devotees like that. So thank you all so much. I think, there was a comment from Priyojana Prabhu. Even if we think we are innocent, actually we are not innocent. Our innocence may be from our past life, but it's just coming back to us. Yes. Thank you so much. So Hare Krishna, thank you devotees for this opportunity. As I said, by saying this, I'm not claiming in any way that I have them, but it's something that I very much aspire for. As I said, this is a trait in all the great devotees of the Lord. And so this has given me some inspiration. This interaction between the Lord and Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya has given me a shining example of what to aspire for. And hopefully I can get there one day. Hare Krishna.